It's a little bit of a unique format. So the panelists that are present today all pre-recorded a 5-minute video, which we're going to play together. Following that, we'll have about a half-hour discussion about the videos that we just saw, or the concepts more generally. And then after that, we'll play the videos from the panelists from the first session that played earlier Monday in the middle of the night here in the US, so that people can see those. And then a last 15-minute wrap up. So that's the format. One request. Can you please, any technical questions or things that you want discussed during the open discussion, please type into the Q&A box instead of the chat. And I'll be keeping tabs on those and moderating the discussion that happens soon. So anyways, let's go ahead and play the first video, and we'll talk in about 35 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to get into the first discussion period, and there were a number of questions that came in. Again, I think due to the number of attendees, we're going to try to do this through the Q&A, and I'll try to group them kind of in order of the presentations that came in. So first, I guess, questions related to filtration. So Professor Miller, I guess this would be directed to you. How is the clean air delivery rate measured, or is it calculated? How is that kind of certified? And then a follow-up question about MERV 8 versus MERV 13 and how that relates to HEPA and how that all works.
Sure. So the clean air delivery rate is a combination of two important parameters for filtration. One is the flow rate through the filter, and the other is the efficiency of the filter. And then you also need to know that sometimes filters are not seated right in their holdings, and so some bypass can happen. So one of the things that you do with the clean air delivery rate measurement, you test it in the lab, you put it in a chamber, you generate a known concentration of aerosol. When you stop generating your aerosol, you turn on your air cleaner and you measure the decay of particles in the chamber. And then you use that data to estimate what the clean air delivery rate would be for this device to provide you with clean air in the setting that you're applying it. So that's what the test I've done in my lab looks like, and many people have done that. Air cleaners have been tested for many decades. There's plenty of papers in the literature to show how effective they are at reducing health effects of wildfire smoke, of cooking, and now of, also of infectious disease transmission. The MERV rating is an ASHRAE rating that gives you an understanding of how efficient the filter is for different particle sizes. And as you go up in number, then the filter becomes more efficient at smaller particle sizes, around 0.5, 0.3, 0.5 microns. A MERV 8 is a standard filter. When you go up to MERV 13, you're getting really, really close to a HEPA grade, which would be above a MERV 16. Is there anything else I should answer there?
I guess there was one follow-up question about the impact on air handlers between going to higher MERV rating and pressure drop, and to what extent that retrofit can be done.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely recommend consulting a ventilation expert when you're upgrading your filter to a higher rating, because you can create significant pressure drop, and you may damage the components of your system. So it is something that you need to make sure that your system is capable of doing. I will say in my work that we have been looking at going from a MERV 8 to MERV 11. You get quite a significant drop in infection risk just going up to MERV 11. Recommendations have been to go to MERV 13, but if you can't make it to MERV 13, any improvement, even a MERV 8 is a really reasonable approach for filtering your recirculating air.
Great, thank you. Okay, I guess this is a question for Alfred about the inactivation rate. Where did the inactivation rate value come from, or how is it calculated? I guess just more generally, what do we know about inactivation rate for discussion by others?
Well, I'm not a virus expert and I'm not an indoor air quality expert. What I have done is implementing the tool or the model presented in the preprint of the quantitative assessment of Bonanno and colleagues. And they use the inactivation rate of Van Doremalen et al. And colleagues, and this is 0.63 per hour. But you can put any number in the tool if you want.
Okay, great. And I believe that was half-life on the order of an hour, but I think since then,
yes,
other...
half-life is an hour and 9 minutes or so, or 1.09 hours or 1 hour 5 minutes, something like that.
Okay. And then I think since then there's been other drum experiments, I think by Fears, I think others with much longer reported half-lives. So currently a topic of great interest. Another question about risk calculation for adults versus children, and it seems that most of the assumptions are relating to adults, and how could that be extended for children? So I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to jump in on that. I think, when obvious thing is just the respiratory minute volume would be lower, so that would play a role on some level. But certainly it gets into questions about infectious dose and many other things that I think we just don't really know at this point. So I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that. If not, I can certainly move on.
Yeah, Alex, this is Marcel. Yeah, for our model, when we differentiate between the two, it was only related to pulmonary rates. That was it. Like you said, the other research relative to dosage for child versus adults, we don't have enough. At least, I'm not an expert here either, but as far as what I could tell, digging into stuff, there isn't enough information out there to do much more than that.
Okay, great. Just one question from Professor Nardell about, I guess, conceptually, emphasis on filtration and evidence surrounding the capability of viral transmission through HVAC ductwork, I presume, and what evidence there is for that, and to what extent filtration should be emphasized or considered as a substitute for ventilation. So I don't know, I guess Professor Miller, if you want to start with that one.
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question? I think there were two questions there.
Yeah, I think it was, is the emphasis on filtration justified by sufficient evidence of viral transport and concentration through HVAC ductwork? And I guess it's two things. It's the difference between in-room portable filters and filters in air handlers. So it might also help to clarify that, and how virus aerosols are removed with the different types of filters, and what evidence might exist for one versus the other.
Yeah, so the emphasis on filtration came about because we realized really early on that infection risk was very high in poorly ventilated spaces. Now, many spaces around the world are poorly ventilated, especially in the US, when many spaces have not been designed for high outdoor air rates, and also windows are not openable. So when you cannot provide a high ventilation rate, then you supplement with filtration. or you provide some outdoor air and you recirculate the indoor air through a filter. I think that in the, in a single zone where you have a person that's infected and is generating aerosol that's infectious, in a single zone, you need to provide particle-free air to that zone, whether it's outside air or recirculated filtered air. If you can't provide those rates, then you also supplement with a clean air delivery rate through a filter. Now, those are only, applicable through, for smaller spaces. For much larger spaces, you need to provide that clean air by something else like germicidal UV. And so, these are talking about, a single zone like a restaurant or a school classroom that there's a probability of infection, and we need to provide virus-free air. How do we do that? Outside air, filtration, germicidal UV. When you talk about spaces that are connected to ductworks or open doors or, different, then that's a whole different question. We have yet to see, really strong evidence of transmission through infection through ductwork in ventilated buildings, for example.
Great. Does anyone have anything else to add to that on the panel? Okay. Another good question about the Wells-Riley model and its subsequent transient variations and the assumption of completely mixed air, and under what circumstances is that a reasonable assumption? Under what circumstances is it not? And what are the resulting implications of that? So I'm not sure if anyone wants to add that one.
I mean, I have a rule of thumb for a well-mixed assumption, and that's based on many years of research and papers that I've read on the topic, which is that, it's a good assumption for a room. There's lots of buoyancy with people in the room. It's a fine assumption for like my office, or an open floor plan in a home can reasonably, for a single floor. When you start talking about having to move air through doorways or move air through stairwells, then the mixed assumption breaks down. But you can definitely see from data, for example, that when you cook in your kitchen, you really quickly can detect those particles up in your second story bedroom. So, even though you have different floors and different rooms, the well-mixed assumption is good for the single zone, which is where the infection is going to happen with this person that is potentially infected.
Okay, great.
That's an indoor air quality person speaking, not a ventilation engineer. So maybe Lisa has a different take on it.
No, Shelley, I think you answered that perfectly clearly, where you have, not such large, when you have a space where the infection could occur, that's most likely well mixed, since it did travel to that other person.
Thanks.
Yeah, and for certain applications, tracer testing is usually very interesting results that give you a reasonable idea of the extent of air mixing. And for others, CFD modeling can actually reveal some pretty extraordinarily useful insights on ventilation effectiveness. So beyond just raw air changes per hour, actually how effectively a ventilation system is removing aerosols from different parts of the room, and looking at different metrics such as like mean age of air and things like that. So that's certainly a field that needs to be more emphasized, and I think it is. And over time, we expect to see more of that. So there is one question about emission, or multiple questions about emission rates, and given significant variation and variability, what values to use, what's the appropriate value to use in this type of modeling. So I put that out to the panel. Okay, so obviously it's a difficult question. I think the variability in viral load speaks to the challenge as well as the epidemiology and improved understanding of dispersion in the reproductive number and certain number of individuals responsible for the majority of infections and things like that. So I think everyone would agree that it's important to look at a range of possibilities and try to come up with, sensitivity analysis of the results. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that.
I mean, in light of the huge variability, in the webinar on Monday, Michael Riediger had a comparison with different fighters and compared the super spreader with a Rumbo fighter. And what he was advocating, if I understood it correctly, is that you should either calibrate with a super spreading event, because if you calibrate with a low emitter, your measures probably won't help if there is a higher emitter.
Okay, yeah, and then a somewhat related question that just came in about whether the models or the tools agree with each other on the estimate of probability of infection, and from my looking at them in general, they do, as they generally should, considering they're more or less using the same equations. However, it depends on what's used for this emission rate as the key differentiator. So it is an important question.
And Alex, if I could add there, it does seem that everyone is benchmarking the same case, so that, we start with the model being benchmarked to the Skagit Valley coral outbreak, and then from there you can now apply it to different scenarios.
And I'll add that the NIST tool does not quantify risk or probability of infection. It is only looking at airborne concentration and how you can reduce your exposure. So it won't tell you like number of people infected versus how many people are in this space.
Okay, one quick question about displacement ventilation. That's, I think, getting to what I was alluding to with using CFD, that the completely mixed assumption doesn't physically model displacement ventilation configuration, and that would be more of a site-specific evaluation. One general question I received earlier, if you were going to assess a space, what are the key parameters that you measure? So if you want to assess a space for the potential for risk of inhalation of infectious aerosols, what do you measure? What physical parameters do you measure? If you had to hire an engineering company to measure, what should they focus on? So, I mean, I think starting with the HVAC system is, are we talking about naturally ventilated place? Are we talking about mechanically ventilated place? And mechanically ventilated specifications of the system in terms of its airflow and the outdoor air fraction, as well as the design of the supply and the exhaust. Testing and balancing firms generally can do this type of work. The dimensions of the space with these box models, that's really the key input, together with the air exchange rate. And then some idea of the occupancy and the activities that people are doing in the space. So it's not a tremendous amount of information to do these types of simple analyses. And I think that's part of the point, is to get people to actually assess these things for their specific space, versus making some assumption that this it was designed to some standard, 60 ASHRAE 62.1 or whatever it is, but many different things can happen with actual building operations and outdoor air dampers and other things, which is why it's important to physically inspect. And I think that's one of the real utilities of these tools is encouraging people to go through the analysis on the site-specific level and evaluate their air handler and their spaces. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add about what data inputs to get to use these tools. Okay, so one last question, I think related to what Professor Miller said about benchmarking against the Skagit Valley chorus. Yeah, and I think, is that reproducible or representative of other spaces? I think it's key to think about in terms of the activity. But, we certainly encourage others with the, hundreds, if not thousands of super spraying events that have happened around the world, some of which have been reported, to look at those scenarios with the tools and see how things compare. It's just going to be more and more and more. There's different databases that are being compiled of super spraying events, some with more information than others in terms of the setting. But either way, with some report of the attack rate, you can make these kinds of inferences. Okay, I'm just scanning through to see if there's any new questions. We should move on to the next video set because we want to make sure there's time for those. Okay.
Alex.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Maybe something to add about the question about virus transmission through air handling units. I can remember in 2003, Menzies published a paper in the Lancet about research, 2 buildings. One of the buildings was executed with UVGI and the other one not. Long story, short saying, they noticed a difference in well-being and sick leave, but they didn't measure a difference in let's say, in colony forming units inside the building. So their perception was the results should be or were the results of virus transmission, which were, let's say, in this case, inactivated by the UVGI in that building. So we did in 2009 a research in Germany to prove that statement and sent through the air handling units, prepared bacteriophages, several kind of types, and we proved stay viable through the air handling unit. So there are a few papers indicating that, and if someone wants, we can share them.
Okay, so another new question about humidity, but let's move on and play the next set of videos, and then we'll circle back to the question of humidity. Okay, so that was the end of the video. So now we have another 15 minutes or so for other questions. I see there's some good engaged chat going on, so that's great. Any specific questions, please paste into the Q&A. There was one question I saw somewhere about humidity that I wanted to circle back to. So something I find interesting is the difference of opinion between, I mean, not necessarily opinion, but difference in strength of recommendations between ASHRAE and REBA surrounding this. So I guess the general question was whether any of the tools incorporate changes in room relative humidity. And then I guess just more generally, discussion on that issue. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in.
I do just want to comment that I think relative humidity is becoming more of an interesting parameter that people wanting to talk about. And I personally defer to Lindsay Marr, who's my colleague who does a lot of work on virus aerosol dynamics. And some of her work shows relative humidity is really critical. And other experiments show maybe not so critical. So, you have to really take a good look at the literature, I think. And I think we need to know more too.
Yeah, and what I come down to with this from the standpoint of practicality is that almost no facilities have humidification systems outside of, cultural preservation, some data centers and hospital areas and things like that. But in terms of public spaces, it's not practical in terms of retrofitting an air handler with a dry steam humidifier or something like that, or a large ultrasonic humidifier. So then people go to in-room small little humidifiers. And so my guess is that's where Reva's coming from in terms of the practicality of recommending humidification is just not really being an option for many places. Department of Homeland Security produced a tool on aerosol stability of SARS-CoV-2 as a function of relative humidity and UV index, which if you, Google that, it'll come up, and you can see the general effect of increased viability at lower relative humidity. That's what the general consensus is. Okay, let me see if there's any last questions here. Any tools to estimate the effect of UV treatment, upper room, GUV, or ionization? It's a good question. One way to handle it is to use an equivalent air exchange rate, which upper room UV is capable of achieving quite high equivalent air exchange, well over 20. I'm not Professor Miller, you may be aware of other tools that have been developed specific to UV or not, or what the state of science is on that one.
No, I haven't. I mean, I have done some prior work looking at models where we have a two-zone approach with an upper zone and a lower zone. And but I typically do just apply an additional equivalent air change to a model to estimate the impacts from the system, as long as it's been designed according to the guidelines that we've published with the CDC for healthcare facilities for using upper air room systems.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm aware of many places here in New York that are retrofitting air handlers with UV lights in the air handlers and on the filter rack. And I mean, the key concept there is it's getting to the same issue of filtration in an air handler versus in the space, and you're limited by the flow going through it, as well as these general questions about viability of virus and capability of transport and concentration through an air handler. So clearly that's the most cost-effective UV solution, especially for spaces with lower ceilings, but the upper room is really where the potential is. So I'm sure there'll be increased interest in that because of all this. Okay, let's see other questions. In the chat, there was significant back and forth about infectious dose, and I'm aware of a number of papers looking at that, so I expect more to come out on that. Questions. Okay, well, I guess we'll do a last call for any questions in the Q&A, or if any panelist just wants to jump in on a topic discussed, if have anything to say.
I just want to add that, yeah, there's incredible uncertainty in this whole pandemic situation, right? But we know a lot more now than we did. And these tools are really designed to help make good decisions and right policy. And, what I learned from doing our work is that if you try to reduce the risk of transmission during the choir event by just ventilating your way out of it, you're only going to reduce the risk by 50%. And that's not enough. And so if you also add masks and filtration and reduced occupancy and less time indoors, you can get the risk down by an order of magnitude. And that's why we keep saying, you know, understand that your risk is mitigated by this layered approach and not necessarily by just one thing, you know. So I think these tools are important to help us make decisions on how to keep ourselves safe.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think it's very fascinating, the explosion of interest in the subject, obviously, and the amount of work that's being done. I think one thing that's interesting is there was some quite amazing work being done at the University of Maryland regarding ventilation in dormitories that was begun before all this, looking at high ventilation buildings and low ventilation buildings and ventilation rates per person and incidence of respiratory infection. So I encourage people to look into those papers as well. Okay. All right, so last call on questions. There's been a number of requests for the videos, and they will be posted. And I think all the slides had contact information for questions. I think there's been some good dialogue here, and hopefully it continues. And we'll end on time, which is always good. And thanks everyone for their attention. So last call, and then I think we'll sign out. All right. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good December. Stay upwind. And,
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.